But elsewhere, the Elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon, bidding them beware. For Sauron took to himself the name of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and they had at first much profit from his friendship. As centuries of the Second Age of Middle-earth passed, the chaos of the First Age seemed but a memory to the Elves. But Sauron had also not forgotten. He remembered Morgoth's nihilism, the Elves' resistance, and Belerion's destruction. The powers of the West seemed idle, as Middle-earth drifted through its second great age with no purpose or direction. And he devised a plan of his own. A plan for order and coordination, to bring those who would resist his plan and his wisdom under his dominion. Welcome back to Forged in Shadow, my exploration of Tolkien's Rings of Power. In part 1, I laid the foundation, answering what the Rings of Power are, who made them, and why they carry such a heavy weight across both the Second and Third Ages of Tolkien's legendarium. I briefly looked at the symbolism of the rings, the desire behind their forging, and how the pursuit of greater power comes at a great cost. In part 2, I will journey to the heart of the Second Age, to the realm of Eregion, and will introduce Annatar, the so-called Lord of Gifts. We'll see Middle-earth after Morgoth with Sauron's return, the founding and importance of Eregion, Annatar's arrival and influence, other traditions telling us of who possibly resisted him, and how his unmasking and deception set the stage for a war of brutality as Sauron's wrath was finally revealed. Before Sauron conceived of his plan to dominate Middle-earth, before the realm of Eregion even existed, Middle-earth was reeling from the devastating effects of the Dark Lord Morgoth in the First Age. So monumental was Sauron's master Morgoth's impact on the world that his defeat was significant enough to begin a new age, the Second Age. So it was at the First Age's end, the power of the West struck against Morgoth in the War of Wrath. The cataclysmic great battle was fought between the host of the Valar and Morgoth's forces. The tyrant was finally defeated, as we are told in the Silmarillion. He fled into the deepest of his minds and sued for peace and pardon, but his feet were hewn from under him and he was hurled upon his face. Then he was bound with the chain and Gainor, which he had worn aforetime, and his iron crown they beat into a collar for his neck, and his head was bowed upon his knees, and the 2 Silmarils which remained to Morgoth were taken from his crown, and they shone unsullied beneath the sky, and Eonwe took them and guarded them. Thus an end was made of the power of Angband in the north, and the evil realm was brought to naught, and out of the deep prisons a multitude of slaves came forth beyond all hope into the light of day, and they looked upon a world that was changed. When Morgoth was taken in his incarnated form, he was judged and removed from the Blessed Realm, executed as one of the incarnates, and thrust into the void through the door of night. The first great evil of the world had been defeated, but its stain and influence would remain within the world as long as it would last. Morgoth's greatest servant, his lieutenant Sauron, was set to put on a fair hue again and pay obeisance to Eonwe, the leader of the host of the Valar, the banner-bearer of Arda's king, Manwë. He renounced his evil deeds, and some even say that he truly repented, if only out of fear. But as Eonwe was of Sauron's own order, that being the Maiar, the servants of the Valar, pardon was not his to grant. He commanded Sauron to return to Aman, to receive the judgment of Manwë. Ashamed and unwilling to return in humiliation, to possibly receive a sentence of long servitude as proof of his good faith, Sauron hid in Middle-earth, remembering that under Morgoth, his power had been great, and being unwilling or unable to shake off the shackles that Morgoth had laid upon him. As the Second Age begins, Sauron's repentance, feigned or not, the influence of Morgoth, and Sauron's nature become critical in understanding how and why he fell back into evil. The relapse that led him to become the second great incarnation of evil. Middle-earth had been devastated by the events of the First Age, and like all others, Sauron was not created evil, and approached the Second Age from a place of good. It had been his virtue, and therefore also the cause of his fall and of his relapse, that he loved order and coordination, and disliked all confusion and wasteful friction. It was the apparent will and power of Melkor to effect his designs quickly and masterfully that had first attracted Sauron to him. Sauron did not object to the existence of the world, so long as he could do what he liked with it, and his plans to reorganise and rehabilitate the ruin of Middle-earth, apparently neglected by the powers of the West, led him to lust for complete control, for complete power, becoming consumed with hate for the Valar, the greatest power within the world, and the Elves, those who would hold the greatest power within Middle-earth. Middle-earth was, essentially, ripe for the taking, and Sauron would, for its own good, according to his own vision of pure order, shape it according to his will. Remember, Sauron was not wholly evil, even with twisted motives that come from an idea or place of good, in its purest form. As Tolkien says, not unless all reformers who want to hurry up with reconstruction and reorganisation are wholly evil, even before pride and the lust to exert their will eat them up. Sauron is a prime example of a being whose virtues were corrupted and twisted into abhorrent and unrecognisable vestiges, an example of the frightening corruptive influence of Morgoth in the days of his greatness. Sauron had given in to fear when repentance could have led to forgiveness, and he now turned towards those who remained in Middle-earth. In the great battle and the tumults of the fall of Thangorodrim, there were mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. The victory against Morgoth had come at a terrible price for the land of Beleriand, the great region where most of the events of the First Age take place. It left a permanent wound on Middle-earth and its people. Of those people, men and elves were scattered. In my video, The Edain, Tolkien's Men of Light, I detailed the noblest of men of the First Age, the houses of Beor, Haleth, and Hador. The Edain, in their friendship with the Elves, had fought against Morgoth in the First Age and greatly suffered for it. Their loyalty was rewarded with wisdom, power, and life more enduring than any others of mortal race have possessed. The island of Elena was lifted from the sea, and most of the Edain left Middle-earth to found the kingdom of Numenor. For the moment, most of the greatest of men were out of sight and out of mind concerning Sauron's eventual relapse and plans for Middle-earth. Of those of the Edain who remained in Middle-earth, they became vulnerable, as other men had been or would be, to future evils and were scattered following Beleriand's destruction. The greatest of Morgoth's enemies in the First Age within Middle-earth were the Noldor, and Tolkien tells us that the First Age ended with the Great Battle, in which the host of Valinor broke Thangorodrim and overthrew Morgoth. Then most of the Noldor returned into the far west and dwelt in Eresia, within sight of Valinor, and many of the Sindar went oversea also. But many elves lingered, and were unwilling to forsake what little remained of Beleriand, the place they had long laboured and fought for, a motive that Sauron would understand and use to his advantage. Among the great who remained in Middle-earth were Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, the son of Elendil, Elrond, and Galadriel. All three would play major roles as Sauron slowly rose again in Middle-earth. But the elves were, like men, scattered, sundered, weary from the events of the First Age, and scarred. As the Second Age dawned, Beleriand was mostly drowned. The Edain had departed or were disorganised. Elves were dispersed with many returning across the sea, and the Valar seemingly turned their attention inward to the Blessed Realm. Middle-earth, post-Morgoth, was set to become Sauron's Middle-earth. We have reached the borders of the country that men call Hollin, Many elves lived here in happier days, when Eregion was its name. The common tradition of Eregion's history, as I am calling it, is mostly told to us in The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion. Following Beleriand's near-complete ruin and the fading of the great elven realms of the First Age, many of the elves remaining in Middle-earth moved east, and among them were Noldoran smiths and craftsmen. The walls of the Blue Mountains had broken in Osiriand, creating a gap towards the south, allowing the sea to flow in. It was here that the river Lynn had a new course, making the Gulf of Lynn. The elves began to establish realms as they were introduced to this new and changing landscape. Lindon is said to have been established in the very first year of the Second Age, but this name was used for the region of Osiriand in the First Age. It is possible that the year 1 of the Second Age was when Lindon was established as a realm in its own right, with it becoming a kingdom of the High King Gil-galad at this time. And upon the shores of the newly formed Gulf of Lynn, the Grey Havens were founded, Mithlond, also by Gil-galad and remnants of the elves of Beleriand. Some of the Noldor made their way further inland, far beyond the Blue Mountains, to found Eregion. For those with knowledge of Third Age Middle-earth, you would find Eregion or Hollin to the south of Rivendell, west of the Misty Mountains and further west to the west gate of Khazad-dûm. The Company of the Ring passes through this now deserted region in their journey before they change course to Carathras. Eregion is said to have been founded in the year 750 of the Second Age by the Noldor, and despite it not being said outright by Tolkien, I don't think it's a coincidence that the Noldor, devoted to the pursuit of greatness in crafting and the making of things, would found a realm so close to the great mansions of the dwarves. The realm founded by Durin the Deathless was known to elves long before Beleriand fell, and many of the dwarves who had their lands ruined in the Blue Mountains had already made their way to the Dwarrowdelf centuries before the founding of Eregion, enriching Khazad-dûm further, and making it an enticing location to establish relations between two peoples dedicated to the desire for lore, knowledge and skill of hand. And it was from Ostinethil, the greatest city of the elves in Eregion and home of the greatest craftsmen among them, that a friendship arose between dwarves and elves, such as has never elsewhere been, to the enrichment of both those peoples. In Eregion, the craftsmen of the Gwaith Myrdain, the people of the Jewelsmiths, surpassed in cunning all that have ever wrought, save only Fëanor himself. Drawn by their love of craft and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, the elves of Eregion and Ostinethil in particular were eager to continue the craft of the greatest of them from the elder days. The ancient skills and works of the likes of Fëanor created a legacy that could take an age to match, if it could ever be matched at all. That desire burned within them, and had been a part of them from the days of bliss in Aman, when peace prevailed and untold years were spent learning and growing in their skill. And as they were once friends and students of the Vala Aule, now they would cooperate and share in their gifts with those he made, the dwarves. It would be a relationship based on mutual respect for craftsmanship, rather than shared language or kinship. Eregion would represent a new cultural flowering, a renaissance possibly spearheaded by Celebrimbor. In this Second Age Middle-earth that had been marred by war and ruin, Eregion and its chief city of smiths stood for renewal and artistic achievement. The Noldor here not only desired to preserve elven memory, but they wanted to heal and even embellish Middle-earth, an echo of their ancient ambition to shape the world through their skill. Guided by Celebrimbor, who had inherited that restless desire to make and create beyond what already was. Such ambition is what would guide them to create wonders, a legacy that even the rocks and land remember long after the elves have departed. Deep they delved us, high they builded us, fair they wrought us, but they are gone. Of course, such ambition and skill are also what made Eregion, Celebrimbor and the Jewelsmiths uniquely vulnerable to the temptations of Sauron. The second spring for the Noldor in Middle-earth was the chance to create without Valar oversight, to heal wounds left by Morgoth, and to forge new relationships with the dwarves. A yearning for preservation and beauty would set them up for tragedy. Their wish to build things that should endure beyond countless lifetimes would come true with the arrival of Annatar and his gifts, but not in the way they had envisioned. That is the tradition I am calling the known or common tradition, what is accepted as the truth, what most say happened in the history of Middle-earth. However, a work as complex as Tolkien's Legendarium leads to different traditions, and I say tradition rather than version, as in some cases, strands of Middle-earth's history never received a settled definition, and this is the case with Eregion's history involving the figures Galadriel and Celeborn. I want to explain what I mean here in a bit more detail for future reference, for when I inevitably in this video and series mention various traditions of Middle-earth's past. Christopher Tolkien, in the introduction to Unfinished Tales, tells us that the question of consistency is best illustrated in the section The History of Galadriel and Celeborn. It is considered an unfinished tale in a larger sense, not because it is a narrative that ends abruptly, nor as a series of fragments pieced together, but as a primary strand of Middle-earth's history that was never settled definitively, never given a final written form. The inclusion of unpublished narratives allows readers to accept this history as not being fixed, as some independently existing reality reported by the author as a translator, but as a growing and shifting conception in his mind. When the author has ceased to publish his works himself, after subjecting them to his own detailed criticism and comparison, the further knowledge of Middle-earth to be found in his unpublished writings will often conflict with what is already known, and new elements set into the existing edifice will, in such cases, tend to contribute less to the history of the invented world itself than to the history of its invention. Christopher Tolkien is drawing attention to conflicts and variations, while still allowing us to view Middle-earth's history as a living thing, one that was subject to change and not always known for certain, even to the author. Thus, the differences in Eregion's past should be detailed. These traditions are essentially equal in importance, and neither should be rejected outright in some needless pursuit of the absolute truth or canon. Christopher said it better than I ever could. Divergent versions need not indeed always be treated solely as a question of settling the priority of composition, and my father as author or inventor cannot always in these matters be distinguished from the recorder of ancient traditions handed down in diverse forms among different peoples through long ages. When Frodo met Galadriel in Lorien, more than 60 centuries had passed since she went east over the Blue Mountains from the ruin of Beleriand. Of this, two things are said, though which is true only those wise could say who now are gone. In this tale, Galadriel and Celeborn made their way east from the Blue Mountains in the year 700 of the Second Age and established the realm of Eregion. The building of its chief city, Ostinethil, started about 750, which is the year we are told Eregion was established in the common tradition. The location is of course the same here, but the reasons why Eregion was chosen are mainly attributed to the wisdom and foresight of Galadriel. Despite the dwarves dwelling in Khazad-dûm being presumed to be innocent in the destruction of Doriath in the First Age, Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, never forgave dwarves of any kind for its destruction, and had no liking for dwarves in general. But Galadriel possibly foresaw the residue of evil left behind by Morgoth, and knew that a union of all peoples was perhaps the only way to overcome this. She also knew the skill of dwarves in battle, and considered them fine warriors to pit against the orcs, viewing dwarves through the eye of a commander. And just as in the common tradition, she as Arnaldo viewed dwarves with a natural sympathy through their passionate love of crafts of hand, They were viewed as the children of Aule, and she had been a pupil of both Aule and his spouse Yavanna while she dwelt in Valinor. In the company of Galadriel and Celeborn was Celebrimbor, seen here not as a chief architect of the realm, but as a survivor of Gondolin, who had been among Turgon's chief craftsmen. His genealogy was later altered to make him a descendant of Fëanor. The history of these changes is something that will be covered in part 3 of this series, Celebrimbor, the heir of Fëanor. Still, he had a dwarvish obsession with crafts, becoming the chief artificer of the entire realm of Eregion, and becoming close with the dwarves, especially Narvi, as seen in the inscription upon the west gate of Moria. Both elves and dwarves had great profit from this association, so that Eregion became far stronger, and Khazad-dûm far more beautiful, than either would have done alone. I will speak more of this tradition involving Galadriel's importance in Eregion as I progress through Eregion's history. However, it is essential to note that in this tradition, Galadriel plays a significantly greater role, not only in Eregion's founding but also in establishing relationships with the dwarves and other elves, serving as a counterbalance to the growing influence of evil in the east. But in both traditions, it is still Celebrimbor who is the chief craftsman of Ostinethil and Eregion as a whole, and he plays the greatest part in what I see as Eregion's rise as the home of ingenuity and skills of hand in Middle-earth, and its fall to ruin with the arrival of Sauron. And Eregion is always the stage upon which Sauron would perform his great deception, with elves seeking knowledge and greater power to preserve. In Eregion was forged the rings of power, and the doom of Middle-earth. Within Eregion appeared the people of the Jewelsmiths, the Gwaith y Myrdain, founded by Celebrimbor and the Noldor of Lindon settling there. They dwelt in the House of the Myrdain within the capital city, Ostinethil, and their reputation grew alongside their close friendship with the nearby dwarves. For over 4 centuries, the artistry and skill of their craft flourished, eventually drawing the attention of an admirer named Annatar, who appeared before them in the year 1200. Eregion was not the first place Annatar visited, as we are told that Elrond and Gil-galad doubted Annatar and did not permit him to enter Lindon. They did not know in truth who he really was, but doubted him nonetheless. They even sent a warning to Eregion in case he should appear in that land. But it was in Eregion where he was received gladly. This was in reality Sauron, though at this time he could still appear fair, and he came before the elves of Eregion as one both fair and wise. It was in Eregion that the counsels of Sauron were most gladly received, but in that land the Noldor desired ever to increase the skill and subtlety of their works. Moreover, they were not at peace in their hearts, since they had refused to return into the West, and they desired both to stay in Middle-earth, which indeed they loved, and yet to enjoy the bliss of those that had departed. Sauron, not of mortal race, but as a Maya, was able to assume a fair semblance if he would, and had the power and subtlety to conceal his true motives from the eyes of elves and men. The name he took, Annatar, means Lord of Gifts in Quenya, and like many other great folk, he had many other names. Artano, another name in Quenya meaning High Smith, and Aulendil, Quenya for servant of Aule or one devoted to the service of Aule. All of these names emphasized credentials. He was presenting himself as an emissary of the Valar, specifically a servant of the smith Aule. Sauron had once been a servant of Aule before serving Melkor. He was great among Aule's people at one time, so appearing as his servant would not require him to feign knowledge or understanding of that domain, just the ability to lie about abandoning Aule. Is it any wonder the elves of Eregion were taken by Annatar almost immediately? Though we have an example of an elf being an emissary of the Valar in Glorfindel, it is far more likely that the elves of Eregion saw Annatar as a Maya. the Maiar being servants of the Valar, and one appearing from Valinor with gifts of knowledge and skill was almost like an endorsement. Their skill had been noticed, and their refusal to return west at the end of the First Age had not mattered. One had come who could elevate their great skill even further, allowing them to possibly rival the works of Fëanor and the Noldor in Valinor. Sauron saw an opening, as the Noldor of Eregion were deeply motivated by skill, understanding, and arcane knowledge, motivated by matching the works of those who came before, such as Fëanor. The fair semblance mentioned by Tolkien is crucial in understanding the difference in approach between Sauron and his master Morgoth. Unlike Morgoth, whose tyranny was immediate and open, brutal and forceful, Sauron wore the mask of a benefactor, able to understand the desires and fears of his enemies, and able to assist them while cloaking his true motives. Sauron's greatest weapon was not the overwhelming iron fist of Morgoth, but one wrapped in a velvet glove. Deception wrapped in beauty and understanding. His strategy in Eregion shows a different side to evil in the Legendarium, and one of profound danger. A great enemy can appear as a saviour and mentor, and evil does not always appear as an obvious threat. It can appear as a friend, it can offer gifts, and it can appeal to our highest virtues: preservation, beauty, and understanding through knowledge. To the Elves of Eregion, Annatar was the embodiment of their creative vision and dreams. What I find particularly interesting about Sauron's episode in Eregion is that he is the perfect embodiment of the false angel, a fallen angel. The gifts he promises are not a lie. Well, not completely. He offers the elves the knowledge to preserve what they love, and to gain the ability to raise their realms in Middle-earth to paradises of timeless beauty and enrichment. The Rings of Power can do this, and the Three Rings show us what Sauron taught can effectively be used in ways he never intended. To effectively corrupt, Sauron gives what he promises, but hides the full truth. It would be harder to see deception if Annatar is openly and willingly offering guidance and knowledge, openly offering what he says he was sent to do. He hides that his own goals rely on this, the hidden motive. Sauron in Eregion is almost like a trickster figure, offering W. Jacobs' monkey's paw, fulfilling wishes at a great unknown cost. Be careful what you wish for, lest it come true. And just to conclude this section, what exactly were these gifts that he offered? The making of things they never dreamed possible, new techniques in smithing and enchanting, and the making of artifacts. It was the noble goal of healing and preserving Middle-earth, growing Middle-earth into something even greater. Annatar explains his journey to the Elves of Eregion, and it becomes easy to understand why the Elves were so taken in by him. Alas, for the weakness of the great, for a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eresia, nay, even as Valinor? And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth as do I. Is it not then our task to labour together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught, to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea? As I have established, the Elves of Eregion not only loved the art of crafting, but feared change. Annatar's gifts directly targeted their fear and longing. Tolkien tells us in letter 131 that he lingers in Middle-earth, very slowly, beginning with fair motives, the reorganizing and rehabilitation of the ruin of Middle-earth, neglected by the gods. He becomes a reincarnation of evil and a thing lusting for complete power, and so consumed ever more fiercely with hate, especially of gods and elves. Sauron originally presented his lust for power as a way to reorganise and rehabilitate Middle-earth. To the elves traumatised after centuries of war, this was attractive. To most, Annatar was not their enemy. Yet, not all were swayed by this almost messianic figure. As stated earlier, Gil-galad and Elrond rejected Annatar's approach. But why? Tolkien never states outright why these figures rejected Annatar, but I think we can speculate why based on the reasons the elves of Eregion accepted him. Of course, it could be that both somehow maintained a strong connection to the Valar, despite being elves of Middle-earth, or that both retained memories of Morgoth's own deceptions, making it harder for them to accept something that seemed too good to be true, a saviour at a time when elves would be vulnerable. I see it as more related to the desires and fears of the elves of Eregion themselves. Their obsession with crafting, legacy, and the fading of their works would overrule wisdom. They were eager students, with a passion for creation that could easily be exploited. No different from Sauron being able to exploit man's fear of death with ways to circumvent it. His gifts were too good to ignore in Eregion for what could be achieved with them. Tolkien shows us the folly of desiring greater power, the cost, the price. Annatar was not able to deceive all elves equally. His seductive approach worked brilliantly on some, but others with greater wisdom resisted. This is a contract that reveals much about elvish character and motivations. But in 3 centuries of Annatar dwelling in Eregion, he embedded himself so thoroughly that Eregion's society and identity were shaped around his teachings. By the time Sauron's true purpose was revealed, Celebrimbor and the Jewelsmiths were already enmeshed in the power of the rings. The elves who accepted Annatar shared Sauron's lack of humility and acceptance of the world's natural order and flow. They grew to believe they could fix Middle-earth and halt change. A fall for the elves despite original good motives. Their virtue had been twisted into rebellion. Things get complex when we look at the alternative tradition of Annatar's time in Eregion. Much of this complexity comes from what I discussed in the Founding of Eregion section, namely the role of Galadriel and Celeborn in Eregion. Again though, try not to think of these as inconsistencies, as the history of Galadriel and Celeborn is so interwoven with other legends and histories of Lothlorien and the Sylvan Elves, of Amroth and Nimrodel, of Celebrimbor and the making of the Rings of Power, of the war against Sauron and the Númenórean intervention, that it cannot be treated in isolation. Galadriel was aware that Sauron had been left behind, so to speak, following the captivity of Melkor. Since Sauron had as yet no single name and his operations had not been perceived to proceed from a single evil spirit, prime servant of Melkor, Galadriel perceived that there was an evil controlling purpose abroad in the world, and that it seemed to proceed from a source to the east, beyond Eriador and the Misty Mountains. No explanation is given as to why Galadriel scorned Annatar in Eregion, but Annatar bore it with patience and courtesy. Of course, if Galadriel perceived that Annatar was indeed Sauron, why would she permit him to remain in Eregion? It seems more likely that she had the same insight and perception as Elrond and Gil-galad, which would be easy to accept, but was somehow overruled by Celebrimbor and the Smiths, or that she would keep a watchful eye on this figure who had attempted to enter other lands before Eregion. Either way, Sauron began to work in secret with the Gwaith y Myrdain, that brotherhood that had grown in power and influence in Eregion. So great was his hold upon them, and their greater influence in Eregion, that they were convinced to revolt against Galadriel and Celeborn, seizing power from them, and that took place between the years 1350 and 1400. Galadriel would leave Eregion, yet Celeborn curiously stayed behind, as he would not enter the mansions of the dwarves as Galadriel did. Celeborn became an isolated figure in Eregion, ignored by those in charge. In different drafts, Celeborn also refuses to deal with Annatar in any way, highlighting the internal struggles within Eregion politically. Accounts of Galadriel vary over the many years Tolkien spent on his legendarium. Her wisdom increases to almost saint-like proportions as we approach the last writings, and her mistakes diminish in number. Yet most accounts of Galadriel and her dealings with Annatar have her be skeptical and wary of what he offers, perhaps having the wisdom to know that the natural order should not be challenged this way, but I find this unlikely, as later she accepts and uses one of the three rings, Nenya, to satisfy a desire to rule a land of her own in Middle-earth. There, creating a land of timeless bliss until the days when the ring's powers ended. What complicates Galadriel's time in Eregion, further, is her relationship with Celebrimbor. In some drafts, Galadriel is a central figure who guides Eregion's policy. In others, she is a peripheral figure, dwelling mostly in Lorien. And the degree to which Celebrimbor defied or followed Galadriel shifted dramatically. Unfinished Tales, in a draft of the Elisar, speaks of Celebrimbor loving Galadriel, and of her being the influence for the creation of the Elisar itself, the Elfstone, green jewels of healing power. "That is its fate, I deem," said Celebrimbor, "but you know that I love you, though you turned to Celeborn of the trees, and for that love I will do what I can, if haply by my art your grief can be lessened." This does not mesh well with open rebellion against Galadriel in Eregion, unless the gifts of Annatar were so enticing, and his grip so strong, that such a love could be forgotten about in his desire for increased skill and subtlety. I think what is important to take away from common and alternative traditions of Eregion's story is that some elves saw through Annatar, at least enough to not accept his gift so willingly. But more importantly, Celebrimbor and the Jewelsmiths never did. Any division caused is just another explanation of the darkness of the Second Age, the conflict that can be caused by Sauron's mere presence. For what it's worth, I like the idea of Galadriel's own ambition to create something magnificent, giving her a clearer focus in Eregion, an instinctive rejection of Annatar through a deeper spiritual wisdom, the same foresight that would later guide her into rejecting the One Ring itself. Rejection of Annatar showed just why Sauron feared and hated the Elves. He was unable to corrupt the leadership of the most powerful elven kingdom at the time, Lindon, and had his influence restricted to Eregion. Still, this would be enough to change Middle-earth forever. Annatar's betrayal of the Elves was a centuries-long game of deception. We learn from the Tale of Years, published in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, that Annatar first appeared to the Elves in the year 1200 of the Second Age, dwelling among them, gaining their trust and instructing them in his knowledge of craft. 16 great rings of power were forged by the time Annatar left Eregion around the year 1500. With Annatar gone, Celebrimbor, with his desires and the newfound skill and knowledge provided by Annatar, forges the rings known as the Three by 1590 of the Second Age. Finally, Sauron is said to forge the Master Ring, the One Ring, by the year 1600 of the Second Age, the final and greatest of the Great Rings. The fair mask of Annatar worn by Sauron lasted centuries, but did not last forever. When his true designs were revealed, it altered the course of the Second Age, and set Middle-earth on a path toward open war and darkness. The moment Sauron's treachery was revealed is provided in several sources, such as its importance. The Silmarillion tells us that with Sauron wearing the One Ring, he could perceive all things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. But the Elves were not so lightly to be caught. As soon as Sauron set the One Ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived that he would be master of them, and all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear, they took off their rings. The Elves were not so lightly to be caught. They were aware of him, they knew him, they took off their rings. of the Rings of Power and the Third Age seems to indicate that at least a group of the elves in Eregion wore Rings of Power, and were aware of Sauron's treachery and deceit, taking off their rings when Sauron first wore the one ring he had forged. The account is slightly different as Gandalf tells it in The Lord of the Rings, where he says, "For in the day that Sauron first put on the one, Celebrimbor, maker of the three, was aware of him, and from afar he heard him speak these words, and so his evil purposes were revealed." This may not seem like a big difference, but I think it's big enough to warrant an entire section dedicated to it in part 4 of this series, the 3 elven rings and their light. Why? Because to me it indicates that Sauron's plan for the elves with the Rings of Power may have worked had Celebrimbor not been such a gifted craftsman in his own right, and had not forged the 3 rings without Sauron's presence and interference in Eregion. Many seem to overlook just how and why Sauron's plan failed. Why were the elves aware of him when he wore the one? But later, dwarves and men were not aware of his intentions. Is this just a difference between elves and the other kindreds? Why does Gandalf only mention Celebrimbor and not the elves? Why did Sauron become so hell-bent on revenge against Celebrimbor and a desire for the 3 rings he forged? These are questions I will answer in this series, but for the moment, let's take this at face value and say that when Sauron wore the One Ring, he spoke the words that he inscribed. Ashnask durbatuluk, ashnask gimbatu, ashnask thrakatuluk agburzum ishi grimbatu. His intentions became clear to Eregion, and all rings of power were removed from those who had been wearing them. In that moment, the mask of Annatar had been removed, and the will of Sauron revealed. His intentions could no longer be shielded through a fair form or a silver tongue. By speaking these words, I feel Sauron was binding the rings, a spell of sorts if we call it that, was manifesting Sauron's will into being. It was the point of no return and impossible to shield. Sauron himself had to do this, but he had possibly not accounted for these new rings of power or the perception of the elves. The rings that were tools of preservation and undying bliss were revealed to also be instruments of domination and slavery. The horror and betrayal became immediate and absolute. So overwhelming was this revelation that the desire to use these rings for their original intention, a goal that the elves had wished upon for centuries, became overruled by fear. They would not use these rings, refusing to wear them, refusing Sauron the ability to perceive their actions and master their will. The risk was too great. The desire for this new power was tempting, but not at the cost of freedom. But the damage had been done. The reaction to the unmasking of Sauron's true nature set the stage for direct conflict, and the elves would not escape Sauron's wrath so lightly. But he, finding that he was betrayed, and that the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them with open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him, since the elven smiths could not have attained to their making without his lore and counsel. But the elves fled from him, and 3 of their rings they saved, and bore them away, and hid them. It speaks of Sauron's character that he felt that he had been betrayed in this moment. Tolkien could mean here that the elves refusing to wear their rings, thus not allowing Sauron's plan to work, was a betrayal. But again, I think Tolkien may specifically be speaking more about the 3 rings. Rings Sauron did not intend to exist. Rings that were made without his approval or presence. And to me, rings that had foiled his plan. For Sauron most desired to possess the 3, knowing that the elves who bore them could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world. Still subject to the one, but unsullied since they were made without Sauron ever touching them. They were the culmination of Celebrimbor's great skill and knowledge. And while Sauron is right that they could not be forged without him, he would not be able to bear the thought that such instruments of Celebrimbor's own will would exist without the direct hand of Sauron. Earlier I spoke of this new plan of Sauron in Middle-earth, plan of subtlety and deception. a long game that would span centuries and retain enemies as slaves. I speak in greater detail about Sauron's motives in part 5 of this series, Sauron, the Elves and the War for Souls. But I need to say here that with Sauron seemingly abandoning brute force for deceit, he would be able to conquer a few to then rule the masses. By dominating the likes of Gil-galad, Celebrimbor, Galadriel, and other great lords of the Elves, their peoples could then be dominated. Sauron could hold the strings of the greatest of the great, and they in turn would serve his will through their lands. At least, that's how I imagine Sauron's plan coming to fruition. A plan he recreated later in the Second Age when corrupting Numenor. With the Elves, lands would remain intact, infrastructure intact, and the Lord of Gifts would be a beacon of wisdom, looked upon for his wisdom by those others looked to for their own. Sauron's plan for the Elves failing led to his wrath being unleashed. Deceit, at least when it came to the Elves, was no longer a viable option. The likes of Gil-galad and Elrond had already been careful not to trust what Annatar was offering, and now the smiths of Eregion had revealed that Sauron and Annatar were one and the same. Never again could Sauron attempt a plan like this with the Elves. In anger, he turned to war. He gathered a great force over Carnarthon to invade Eriador in the year 1695. So great was the force that he assembled that it was able to break into Eregion itself with ruin and destruction, and hold off a joint force led by Celeborn and Elrond. The latter arrived with a force sent by Gil-galad. Sauron had returned to the path of Morgoth, the path of destruction, death, and cruelty. His forces assaulted the house of the Jewelsmiths. There, Celebrimbor made a final stand against Sauron on the steps of the Great Doors, desperate to protect the treasures within. The house was ransacked, and Celebrimbor was taken, then put to torment. More than any other since the Elder Days did Celebrimbor suffer the tortures of Sauron. Unfinished Tales tells us that Sauron found 9 great rings before being told where 7 others were by Celebrimbor. Yet the location of Sauron's greatest desire, the 3, was never revealed, and Sauron learned from him where the 7 were bestowed. This Celebrimbor revealed because neither the 7 nor the 9 did he value as he valued the 3. The 7 and the 9 were made with Sauron's aid, whereas the 3 were made by Celebrimbor alone, with a different power and purpose. An editor's note does state that it is not actually said here that Sauron took possession of the 7 rings, though the implication seems clear that he did so. This is because of a belief among the dwarves, told to us in Appendix A to the Lord of the Rings, where the dwarves of Durin's folk believe that the ring of Durin III was given to him by the Elves and not Sauron. Don't worry, this is discussed in part 7 of this series, the 9, the 7 and the Corruption of Kings, where I discuss the other great rings and their varied histories in more detail. Returning to Eregion, Sauron seemed to understand that the location of the 3 would never be divulged by Celebrimbor, and he cruelly put him to death. He guessed the truth, that Elvish guardians must have kept them, meaning Galadriel and Gil-galad. As Elrond's forces approached from the north, the body of Celebrimbor was used as a banner by the orcs, and Eregion was destroyed. Its fall is recorded as occurring in the year 1697 of the Second Age. Sauron's wrath had culminated in the invasion of Eregion. Ost-Denethil was sacked, and Celebrimbor was murdered. This marked the tragic downfall of a kingdom that had for centuries embodied the height of elven craft and ambition, a beacon in the Second Age of Middle-earth following the tumults of the First Age. It didn't just represent some military loss, but a shattering of the elves' hope of preserving Middle-earth from decay. Their attempt to wield the power of nature for preservation had failed with catastrophic consequences. Sauron's betrayal forced the elves to confront reality. No earthly power of such magnitude could be wielded without consequences. The noblest of intentions could be turned against them. What came next in this war is not important to lay out here, due to my focus on the Rings of Power. But the unmasking of Sauron did set off a chain reaction across Middle-earth. As Eregion fell, many surviving elves fled east or into Elrond's forces in the north. Dwarves who had attacked Sauron from Khazad-dûm allowed Elrond to extricate himself and establish the refuge of Imladris. The dwarves facing the full force of Sauron were then driven back, and their gates closed. Elves of Lothlorien were also driven back, and Sauron ravaged lands as he headed for Gil-galad's kingdom to the west. Sauron's attempt to gain mastery of Eriador left his forces divided, as some had to contain Elrond, and Sauron never accounted for the arrival of the Númenóreans from the west. Sauron, having conquered all of Eriador save Imladris, was driven south, and then south again in the Battle of the Gwathlo, barely escaping himself despite reinforcements from Tharbad. He left Eriador in ruins, but returned to Mordor swearing vengeance against Númenor. That's a lot of history to briefly summarise, but you can see the landscape of Middle-earth changing. Eregion would cease to be a home to the Elves, and Eriador in general was ruined at this time. The men of Númenor, whom Sauron had not really considered, became an object of his vengeance, and the saviours of the Elves and Middle-earth at this time. The friendship between Elves and Dwarves would be strained, as Dwarves were forced to retreat inside their halls, and forced to deal with the hatred of Orcs, who were commanded to consistently attack Dwarves wherever they may find them. But most importantly of all, Sauron was now revealed to all in the Second Age. The groundwork had been laid for the struggles of the Second and Third Ages. The distribution of great rings to dwarves and men, the downfall of Númenor, the forging of the Last Alliance, the siege of Barad-dûr, and the War of the Ring. None of these events would have occurred had Sauron's plan not been revealed to Celebrimbor when he placed the One Ring on his finger and spoke his words of domination. Had Sauron not abandoned subtlety for direct conflict, and had he not been driven back to Mordor by the arrival of new enemies in Men of the West. The unmasking of Sauron and his transformation into a Dark Lord of open war reveals a deeper truth in the mythology of Tolkien. The ultimate goal of domination cannot be hidden forever. Deception will collapse into conflict and violence. Malice will always be revealed, and Sauron's unveiling was the inevitable result of his hunger for total power and control, despite any good motives he once held. Here I discuss the aftermath of Morgoth's defeat and the fragile state of Middle-earth at the dawn of the Second Age, leading to the founding of Eregion with its shining promise, and why it became the perfect target for Sauron's schemes. There was the arrival of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and how he seduced the Elves by appealing to their deepest desires, but was unable to seduce all those he visited in Middle-earth at this time. Then I talked about the moment Sauron's treachery was unveiled, the horror of the Elves' realization, leading to open conflict. With the sack of Eregion came a Middle-earth that would be transformed forever. In Celebrimbor, Heir of Fëanor, I will take a deep dive into the life and tragedy of Celebrimbor. I'll examine how the spirit of Fëanor's successes and failures haunted his work, what drove him to follow Annatar, and how his story embodies the tension between creation and corruption in Tolkien's Legendarium. As always, I want to show my appreciation and thank people who continue to support my work on this channel, even when it takes me a long time to research, write, record, edit and produce content. Thank you to Patricia, Victus, Moses, NCV 1993, Dovid, Seraphim 38, Brandon and Lynn.